Hi again and welcome to this next video in the Introduction to Historical Wargaming series. In the last part I gave you a very brief overview of the hobby, the very basics of what you're going to need, and now I'm going to have a little bit more of a detailed look at some of the historical options that are going to be open to you as a gamer. Human history has been shaped by wars and conflict, and it's these events that we're trying to recreate on the tabletop with historical wargaming. Literally every aspect of human warfare can be gamed, and most periods have rules that will cover them. What I'm going to try to do in this video is take each one chronologically and just talk about them in general terms and then show what they have to offer for the wargamer. The terms that I'm using for each period are the ones that are generally understood and used by most wargamers, because we do like to categorise history and put it into big lumps in this way. It does do a little bit of disservice to each era, but it's good enough for our general needs here. And if you're drawn to any particular period of history, there will be a wealth of information that goes way beyond anything that I can cover here anyway. Also bear in mind that the periods that I'm covering here are not as linear as I'm making them. This is simply a device we use to differentiate changes of warfare. But it didn't just stop at a particular date with the next suddenly coming in the next day. The major named wars are slightly different in that we can actually date them to, a particular time. But historical periods are a lot more blurred, as are the systems and methods of fighting as well. Also, keep in mind that what I'm talking about here, with these periods of time, is mostly centred on Europe and the West, as we call it. Partly because this is the wargaming tradition, but also because to cover the entire planet's history of warfare would make for a very, very long video. This by no means diminishes what's happening in the rest of the world at any other time, but I've got to draw a line somewhere, and that's where it's going to have to be. Well, the first and the oldest category is what we wargamers refer to as ancients. This is probably the largest time period that it covers, and it stretches from the dawn of humanity really until probably about the late Viking period of about 1066, the Norman invasion of England. Ancients covers a huge range within wargaming, including tribal warfare, city-states, internecine conflicts, and the rise and fall of empires. Because this period is such a huge chunk, it's probably better to break it into some more of the more popular themes. For my money, these would be the warfare of classical Greece, or also the expansion and rise of the Roman Empire. Both of these span centuries. They involve fighting from in many theatres and areas, all the way from dusty deserts to the grim forests of northern Europe. The range of tactics and types of fighting men and women is vast, even just within these two periods themselves. The Greeks, they used phalanxes, large bodies of men fighting together, while the Romans were reliant on their legions and their legionaries. Both used cavalry and other aspects of mobile warfare, whilst the sword and the spear really remained at the core of the armies. The various Greek states fought amongst one another and sometimes formed alliances. The Romans expanded from their base in Italy, and they took on the European and African forces in their empire building. Civil wars were also rife as well, pitting brother against brother and similar forces lining up against one another in battle. So the possibilities of refighting any of these kinds of clashes on the tabletop is absolutely endless. You can really just pick and choose anything you want. I mean, looking beyond the Romans and the Greeks, we also can model the battles of the Egyptians, the Persians, the Chinese, and so on. A lot of these using wargaming just within that ancient period. The next large period is medieval. This covers a much tighter age range than ancients, but we are talking really from the Battle of Hastings in 1066 AD up to the invention of gunpowder, at least in Europe anyway, so about 1500 AD, so about 500 years or so. Lumping all this time into one title really does a huge disservice to the difference between the soldiers and the warriors at the beginning of the period and those at the end as well. However, we're still looking at people fighting primarily with swords and spears. The later medieval period is dominated by feudal systems, which meant most of the population was in some sort of servitude to a lord or a king. This meant that raising armies was a little easier than the bands of warriors that had dominated the ancient periods. Due to this feudal system, we also see the emergence and the battlefield dominance of the fully armoured and horsed knight. The battles of Crécy, Agincourt, Towton, some of the probably more obvious examples where these men were present and had an impact on the field for good or for ill. So following on from this, and in a tighter date range again, is the Renaissance period. This covers the invention of gunpowder in Europe through in the 15th century up to about the 17th century, where warfare is changed yet again. Wargamers tend to refer to this period of history as pike and shot. This in turn refers to the two main weapons that are used on the battlefield. In a throwback to ancient times, the pike was used. It's basically a long wooden pole with a pointy bit on the end for stabbing. And then we have shots, which is basically the earliest handguns where they're getting developed as well. The pike was a very formidable weapon against cavalry when it was used in a mass block, and also with very well-trained soldiers. The handgun, on the other hand, was very cheap, a simple weapon that could be used with very little training. However, despite calling it a handgun, it actually took two hands to use. It was large, it was unwieldy, it was very slow to reload. So the two developed side by side to provide mutual protection on the battlefield, specifically against cavalry. Cavalry then also developed in retaliation, using their own gunpowder weapons to fire at blocks of troops rather than the charges that we'd seen in previous centuries. And another aspect of the battlefield that was changing and developing through this period as well was artillery. Although there had already existed various ways of throwing large lumps of things at the enemy in previous periods, it's really now that we start to see the emergence of the specialist artilleryman as somebody on the battlefield. Then for the following century or so, we have what we call the next wargaming period, which we call the Enlightenment period. This is roughly between the end of the English Civil War and also the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars. This is an age dominated by commanders such as Marlborough, Frederick the Great, both of whom have retained their rightfully good reputations as military commanders. Previously, we'd seen the distinction between the pike and the handgun, but with the invention of the bayonet, which could be fitted onto the musket, separation between the two could be amalgamated. Infantry became a homogeneous unit which was mobile, had firepower, and then also a defence against cavalry as well. The battlefield was also fluid, with tactical movement becoming increasingly important. Cavalry also reacted against this new threat, losing some of their heavy armour of the past and emphasising movement and speed, and just waiting for a specific time in the battle to attack, as dictated by the infantry in the centre of the field. Both light cavalry and infantry developed as well, making good use of speed and movement to scout or even harass the enemy's positions. And we mentioned it previously as well, artillery had also reached such a stage of development that it was now able to be manoeuvred on the battlefield far easier than was previously allowed. Scientific metallurgy was able to improve the manufacture of guns, making them more stable and lighter, meaning they needed fewer horses and men to actually move them into position. The end of the Enlightenment period really brings us to one of the big boys of wargaming, the Napoleonic period. This begins in the latter stages of the 18th century when Napoleon Bonaparte rose to become First Consul of France in 1799, though some people may take it back a little further to the French Revolution as well. He eventually became emperor, and the next 16 years would see almost continual war raged across the world on land and sea, as various coalitions rose and fought against the Corsican ogre, and alliances were made and lost between various empires and principalities. Tactically, there was a big shift again, with mobility and fluid fighting being the norm. As a revolution in military affairs, this period swept away the old styles of fighting. Conflicts raged across Europe, from the mountains of Portugal all the way to Moscow, and also taking in areas of Egypt and North Africa. Not only this, but the amount of countries that were involved adds a huge colour palette when it comes to making a colourful table. French in blue, the British in red, Russians in green, Prussians wearing grey, Austrians decked out in white, or Spanish in yellow are just some of the uniforms you'd expect to see on a Napoleonic wargaming table. And even that doesn't do justice to the vast array of differing uniforms within each of those armies. If historical research is the thing that appeals to you, then you could spend a lifetime just researching Napoleonic uniforms. On top of this, the Napoleonic period saw a huge increase in the numbers of soldiers fighting in battles. Borodino and Austerlitz involved hundreds of thousands of men. And many, many more smaller skirmishes and battles were fought, countless skirmishes. So from a wargaming point of view, the Napoleonic period really offers a vast array of choice for the newcomer. So following the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and the beginning of the First World War in 1914, Europe really saw a series of smaller wars such as the Crimean War, the Franco-Prussian War, amongst many others. These do not appear to be immensely popular in the world of wargaming, but there are also plenty of rules that do cover these periods. It is an interesting period from a history of warfare point of view, in that tactics were changing with the development of better weapons, such as the rifle and even early machine guns. Men would have been kitted out in uniforms that were no less colourful than those of the Napoleonic period. This is until later on in the period when colonial wars demonstrated the need for camouflage in the face of modern weaponry. The colonial conflicts of this period are the ones that wargamers tend to concentrate on, such as the Anglo-Zulu War, the infamous defence of Rorke's Drift, and also the Boer War as well, with its small unit tactics coming to the fore. However, again, one of the other largest interests in this particular period is the American Civil War. The American Civil War has always been a popular subject for refighting on the tabletop, and it offers a lot to gamers, with battles that look like Napoleonic conflicts with similar sized armies and colourful uniforms. Battles like Gettysburg went on for days, giving you, as a gamer, a lot of opportunity to focus down on particular aspects of the overall battle without having to shell out for thousands and thousands of figures. Then this brings us on to the First World War, which traditionally has not been the subject of many war games until relatively recently. Due to the older duff histories of stalemated trench warfare and misconceptions of men walking into machine gun fire, it's often thought that it's unmanageable unless you're reenacting small-scale trench raids, naval battles, or even aerial dogfights. The latter have always been very popular anyway. The initial contact in 1914 is often gained due to the mobile part of that, but the middle and the end of the war has generally been left alone by wargamers. However, this idea could not be further from the truth, and the battles from 1916 onwards saw a massive change in tactics, including artillery, aircraft and infantry, along with the introduction of the tank. The battles in 1918 were more akin to the fighting in the early part of the Second World War, with plenty of infantry assault using modern-day small unit tactics of firepower and movement. There's a vast amount of modern-day scholarly works that can be mined for information for the First World War, and I have proven myself that it can be wargamed with plenty of after-action reports on this very channel. I could rant all day about this, but I'm not going to make this video too long. Suffice it to say that the First World War is a very rich vein of interesting and challenging gaming experiences for anybody who's interested in wargaming. And then here I'm going to touch briefly on the interwar period. Again, this is something else that is not really particularly taken up by wargamers. It includes a time of civil wars, such as the Spanish Civil War, the Russian Civil War. These two are probably the most famous, the most well known and the most gamed. As I say, this is going to be a very brief touch on it, but there are quite a few similarities between this period and the one that follows as well, the Second World War. However, the scope is more focused, which is probably why the Second World War eclipses it just from an interest point of view. So by far, the Second World War is probably the most wargamed period of history that you will find, and the easiest to get into as well. Lasting from 1939 to 1945, it's one of the most shortest wars in history, but by far the most destructive and costly war ever. Practically the entire globe was affected, with the Allied powers fighting against the Axis on the land, sea and air. Why it's so popular can probably be traced back to the popularity of airfix models and toy soldiers, their tanks and their aircraft in the post-war years. The access to cheap models allows for tabletop battles to be recreated very easily. However, this is not the only reason that it remained the most popular. The vast amount of equipment used by all the different sides allows one to fall into any number of black holes of research trying to work out the exact thickness of armour of each type of Sherman tank. This aside, the Second World War allows you free rein to explore almost any type of combat, from large-scale beach landings on the Normandy coast to small-scale skirmishes as the Japanese advanced through the jungles of Malaya, for example. Naval battles can easily be replicated in miniature, as can aerial battles between fighter planes and huge multi-engine bombers. Massive land invasions like Hitler's attack on Russia mean that monumental tank battles can be refought, and all of this is made even easier with the huge amount of availability of Second World War figures and models of vehicles in every scale imaginable. You'd be hard pressed as well to find an opponent who hasn't actually played at least one Second World War game within the hobby. And then finally we have the modern period. The wars that have fought since the Second World War have gained in popularity as time moves on, and you can easily find a lot of Vietnam War Games rules along with Cold War Gone Hot. These are getting more and more popular in recent years. Although the Cold War Gone Hot scenarios are not strictly historical. The equipment used is, and it covers many types of tanks and troops and vehicles from the 1950s really up to the 1980s and beyond. As other wars are now starting to get classed as history rather than current affairs, such as the Falklands Wars and also the various Gulf Wars, they're starting to make more of an appearance on Wargames tables as well. A lot of the wars in this period are asymmetric and they involve a professional force fighting against militia or guerrilla forces. This can lead to a lot of interesting scenarios where brute force can be checked by local knowledge and an ability to slip away into the night. So these are the main periods of wargaming that fall within the terms of historical wargaming. As I said before, playing a historical wargame doesn't necessarily mean a historical outcome. The challenge is to either do as well or beat the historical figure that commanded the forces that you're fielding. And that is where the fun of wargaming lies, changing history with our toy soldiers. This has been a very rough guide to the main historical periods that wargamers like to explore, and each have their own challenges, appeal and interests that are waiting for you.